Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrew Dalton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Adams County Historical Society in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. If you can hear us okay and see us okay, please let us know in the comments. We want to make sure everything's good before we get started. But I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm very happy to be here with my good friend and board member here at the Adams County Historical Society, Jane Nutter. Jane is also the president of Gettysburg Black History Museum, and we're going to be talking about Black history tonight. We're also going to talk about a very exciting partnership that we've started between the Gettysburg Black History Museum and the Adams County Historical Society. Good. I see people are saying they can hear okay. Um, that's always good. But about the Adams County Historical Society, just briefly, we are the repository for millions of historic items in historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We have documents, photographs, artifacts, just about anything you could imagine that's significant to the community here. We have a research archive, and we're building a new museum and research center for our collection and for all of you to come and so that you can interact with and see the incredible materials that we have here. That building actually is going to be starting later this year. We're going to have an announcement in the next few weeks about groundbreaking, and we hope you'll consider supporting that project and become members of the Historical Society so that you can stick with us. This museum is actually going to have a really interesting component. It's not going to be like any other museum you might know of here in Gettysburg. We're going to tell the entire story of this community, what happened before the Battle of Gettysburg, the lead up to that pivotal moment, and then everything that happened after as well. So it'll be one place where you can go and really get the depth and the perspective behind the story that you might know, the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, but having that larger perspective of how this place came to be what it was. And of course, one of the most important storylines is the story of our African American community. Black history is really important to the Adams County Historical Society, and it's going to be really important in this new museum. And every element of history, and I know Jane and I have talked about this, every single chapter of this community's history, it is also, part of Black history. Black citizens participated in all of the events that they served in every war that our local servicemen and women served in. They helped build the town of Gettysburg. They helped with the birth of the tourism industry. And so we want to highlight some of those stories, and there's no one better on the face of the earth to do that than Jane, who's born and raised here in this community and knows Black history and Black culture here in Gettysburg. And we're so excited to have this new partnership. You may have seen a press release about it, but I just want to briefly talk about that partnership. So, in our new facility, we're going to have an exhibit that will work on collaboratively with the Gettysburg Black History Museum to spotlight some of their rare artifacts and photographs and stories. And then throughout our museum, we're going to have, of course, sections that feature the contributions made by local Black citizens. So we're really excited about that partnership. The collections of the Gettysburg Black History Museum are going to come into our archive so that you can view and learn from those materials, and they'll be safe forever, just like our collection will be. So we're excited about that. We're excited about the exhibits, and we're also going to be doing a whole host of educational programs with the Gettysburg Black History Museum to support their efforts to make sure that these stories are told. So I'm thrilled that Jane was able to be with us tonight to go through some of the history, just really a small part of it, because we could go on and on for hours about local Black history. But we're going to go through some of the stories you may have heard of, some maybe you haven't heard of. And I also want to note that any donations made tonight will be split 50-50 between the two organizations. So if you like the post and you'll consider hitting the donate button, it'll support Gettysburg Black History Museum and the Historical Society. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jane to give a little bit of the history of the Black History Museum, what the organization is, how it came to be. And I also want to note that we're going to show a lot of photographs throughout the presentation tonight, and many are the property of Gettysburg Black History Museum. So we'd appreciate if you didn't copy and use those without permission. But let me turn it over to Jane, and she'll give us an idea of how the Black History Museum was born, what the impetus was, and where things are today. So let me bring up our presentation here, Jane, and you can take it away.
You doke. Okay, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. This is a passion of mine, and you should know that I'm not a historian, but history is a passion of mine. So forgive me if I start to blather, and I hope we have fun sharing these stories tonight. Some of them, as Andrew said, you may have heard about, some of them you may not. Very interesting stories here in Gettysburg, and our stories have really not been told over the years. And we are part of the fabric of this county, of this country, of this town. Our story is the American story. So we want to make sure that we share this story with everyone. And the Black History Museum hopes to do that. We are partnering with the Adams County Historical Society because it is an avenue to share information and stories in history, Black history. But we also, as Gettysburg Black History Museum, we intend, a part of our vision is to have a museum also to share stories and artifacts and ephemera about Black history here in Gettysburg. So by saying that, now I'll move on to the slide there. That's our logo. And if you look on the left slide, that's a picture of my sister, my older sister, I might add, Mary Alice Nutter, who was the founder of the Gettysburg Black History Museum. And I will get more into that later with how this all came about. And St. Paul AME Zion in the background. And that's the corner of Washington Streets and Breckinridge Streets. The slide on the right, is a picture. Annually, we have a gathering of the Gettysburg Black History Museum Board of Directors and local folks who have been very supportive of our efforts. And we have a little gathering and we talk about where we're going and what we're doing. And these folks have been very supportive of our efforts and have helped us to get along our way. Okay, and then the next slide, you will see the board of directors for the Gettysburg Black History Museum. We are a grassroots organization, and these folks have been really dedicated to making sure that this effort comes to fruition. They are spending their time, their efforts, their knowledge, their skills, because I couldn't do it alone. Every one of them. You can see there's Roger Smith, who's the vice president, Jenny Knox, there's Mildred Johnson, Mary Alice Nutter, who's the founder and also a board member, Elmer Shelton, and Marie Williams. This is a cadre of folks who spend their time, dedicate their time, and give freely of their time to make sure of the information that we have is correct and that we do research it to make sure that we're sharing correct and proper information. And the premise of the whole museum is to educate, inspire, and preserve. Now I got that mixed up. It's preserve, educate, and inspire. See the things that we really want to do. And our mission really is to make sure that we share these stories. Heretofore, these stories have not been shared. You know, it's been, and I have to say to you that they have been passed along, most of the stories, in the griot tradition, the African-American tradition. And I have to say this too, sometimes it's not very pleasant because there's often a clash between African-American tradition, oral tradition, and research-based information. Always, you know, it's heretofore, if it's been promoted research-based, then the African-American oral tradition stories are negated. And what I found personally is, and I have to share this, is very poignant to me. I was a very curious child and I loved hearing the stories. And so I did listen to those stories. And when I got older and retired, I promised myself that I would spend some time researching these stories to see if they were true. And I often say this to Andrew. Every story that they shared with me, I have researched and I found to be true. I haven't found one story that they shared with me that was not true. So, and that's very important for you to know, you know, that stories, because many, before, you know, in the early 1800s, Black folk could not read or write. So how they passed on the history and the traditions was orally. So those stories still go on, still to this day in my family and in many Black families, the stories are passed down orally about their history. And our mission is to share this American fabric story of Black history here in Gettysburg, to share it with people so that they know that we indeed were a part of this. And my background is early childhood education, and it's very important for children, no matter the color, very important for them to hear the whole story. and also to hear the story, this story, the Gettysburg Black History Museum, we're dedicating to telling the story in our words, because so often in the past, the story has been appropriated. And still to this day, I was just talking with someone, maybe about 2 months ago, I read something in a book that I knew was not true. But again, because it was written, it is deemed true. So our vision is to tell our story in our words. And the vision that continues on. And we hope to, by including this story, that we will have a more diverse population come to visit Gettysburg. One thing that has always stuck out in my head as a teenager, I worked at the Gettysburg Travel Council in the summers. And one thing that always was very unnerving to me, there were never any Black folk that visited. And to this day, I can still, in the summers when, before the pandemic, it was very rare to see Black families or Black folk visiting. And I have to say this, there's a wonderful article that was written in The Atlantic by a young man, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a writer, about he's from Baltimore and why he never liked coming to Gettysburg. Well, the story that was told here never included Black folk. I grew up here. I went to the schools here. I never learned anything about Black folk or Hispanic folk or Native American folk in my history classes. It was purely colonial history that I was taught. So this truly gives a better rounded picture of the history of our town. And our vision is to broaden that history story and to make the story more inclusive, more diverse, and more factual. And the reason, well, I explained the reason why.
Yes.
It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Jane, about, oral tradition. And, I'd like to point out for the people watching, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but, Jane's great grandfather, just one great grandparent, this is not far back at all in her family tree, was Lloyd Watts, who served in the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. And so, you think about your own family, and I think many of us listening, we know things, about our great grandparents and our great great grandparents that we've heard. And to have, Jane able to speak about these stories that she was told, there's so much value to that. And I think it is really kind of underappreciated. And that's a great point, I think, that you made there. So why don't you tell us, Jane? I know I've had a lot of questions. People are curious about how the organization came to be, and I love this photograph that you included here. Why don't you? Could you tell us a little bit about this group of wonderful people?
Okay. Our history. Now, I have to tell you, this is my tribe. It's maybe a little selfish to say that, but this is the Thomas clan. Everyone in this picture is a grandchild of Lloyd F.A. Watts. Now, how the museum started. The lady in the blue sweater is my mother, Margaret Thomas Nutter. And we still have the table. There's a walnut table that's been in our family. It was made in 1863. Oh, if that table could talk, yikes, stripes. But anyway, around that table, my sister Mary Alice and I, like I said, my older sister, she was sitting with my mom at dinner one time, and she said, Mare, there's a wonderful, rich history of Black folk here in Gettysburg. This story has never been told. So you need to do something about it. And her term was, and anybody that knew her, if she meant business, she would say, look a here. And she was someone who was very, very particular about grammar. But if she meant business, she broke it down and she would say, look a here. And she said that to Mary Alice, we need to have some place where these stories can be told, because if Black folk did not participate here in this town, there wouldn't be a town. And they were very active and very prominent in the development of this town before, during, and after the Civil War. And I have to share this. The board of directors, Mary Alice gathered a group of folk and developed the board of directors, who then helped her to do research. Rogers Smith was in on the ground floor. Rogers is the husband of Jesse Wanzel Smith, who passed away. And Jesse's ancestors were Basil Biggs, and uh, many of you have heard of him before. And there are other wonderful stories. And I do have to say this, Mary Alice really persevered, and she said, okay, we're going to do this. Now, she was working at the time, and when she retired in 2002, that's when she became very serious about gathering a group of folks, grassroots folks, to gather them together and develop a board of directors so that we could start the journey to building a museum, a Gettysburg Black History Museum. And it all started around a walnut table in the kitchen. Now, with the history here, you can see, I'm trying to catch up here.
Oh, no problem.
The history here, there was, one of the things that I always remember the stories being told, not only by my mom, but other Black folk growing up, that there was a thriving Black community here in Gettysburg. And there was a Black restaurant. I just saw there were a Black wagon maker, a Black confectioner, owned confectioner shop, blacksmith shop, a veterinarian, things like this that you never, Black teacher, you never even heard about these stories. And as I would sit around in that group that I showed you back, the Thomas crew, when they would sit around and talk, they would talk about Gettysburg as it was. And as I do research now, I see the names of the people that they talked about. And that's just cool, because it's like you found a long lost friend, that you've seen these people. And then with this slide, if you look up in the corner there, that's a group of young people that would have been in the late 70s or early 70s. And there wasn't a Memorial Day parade. Well, these young Black folk gathered together and they had their own parade, and they went up to Lincoln Cemetery and they did their own service there. And then the slide down at the bottom is a wonderful picture in front of St. Paul AME Zion. And included in that picture are lots of folk that grew up here. And one of the prominent ones, I think Mrs. Myers, Mrs. Amanda Myers is in this picture, and Mrs. Louise Stanton Auntie is also in this picture. And Mrs. Louise Stanton Auntie is the granddaughter of Mag Palm.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. There's so many people, still in the community that have direct ties to those who lived here during the Civil War period. That is just amazing.
Now, on this picture too, it shows a little bit about the folk that were here, and that I do have to say this, the picture up on the right side, that's my mother when she graduated from Gettysburg High School in 1936. And then up on the left side, the top picture, that's a group of Black folk, a Sunday after church, of course, and the one on the bottom also is Sunday after church. And that picture on the left bottom, that was taken on High Street.
Wow.
Okay, Andrew, you're on.
Sure. Yeah, why don't we go? So we're going to go into a little bit of the history now, the early history, and then we'll kind of work up through time and show you some different things. But I did want to point out here, this is just a timeline showing the Black population in Adams County over the years. And this starts in 1800 because Adams County was founded in 1800. It was broken off as a portion of York County. And so you can see the kind of the ebb and the flow of the population growth and then decline. You see also there were enslaved residents here in Adams County for the first 30, 40 years of Adams County's existence. And you can see that kind of trickle off. And we'll talk about slavery a little bit more later in the program. But you can see some of the rises and the declines. There's, of course, a decline in the lead up to the Civil War when fugitive slave laws got really tight and there were less people moving freely through the area. And then there's a larger decline following the Civil War into the 1900s, actually into the 1930s and early 40s. And Jane and I have talked about that, being due to a lack of economic opportunity in the Black community here in Gettysburg. Did you want to say anything else about that, Jane, before we move on?
No, really, when I saw this, this was very interesting to me because if you look at the spike at the end of the graph, one of the things that we must take note of is during that time, because Adams County is an agricultural county, we have to take into consideration the folks that came here from the South to do farm work that settled out eventually. And they were Black folk, they were Hispanic folk, they were folk that came here to work in agriculture, and some folk settled out here in Adams County. And that's a spike there. But also, as Andrew said, in the 40s, I know in the 50s, many of the Black folk moved from Gettysburg because they couldn't make a living. And I know, folks that did go, some Black folk that did go on for higher education did not come back to Gettysburg because there was no way economically that they could survive here.
Right.
They couldn't make the money to survive. So that's all I'd like to add to that.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful context. I think to look at it this way, it gives you a lot of perspective of how the community changed over time. And then this is a what they call a heat map that I made showing the place of birth for all of the individuals that we know of that are buried in Gettysburg's Lincoln Cemetery, the only existing Black cemetery in the borough that is still, a marked place. And you can see, of course, there's a large concentration of African-American residents that were born around the Adams County area, but also a heavy concentration in Northern Maryland and then some in Virginia as well. So, of course, Carroll and Franklin County, Maryland, Frederick County, Maryland. Carroll and Frederick County were a main site for the place of birth for many of these individuals who made their way into Adams County. This is a map from 1850. Actually, the map is from a little bit later, but it shows the population at that time in 1850 per township within Adams County. And you can see actually the numbers represent the number of people who lived there who were born outside Adams County. So you can kind of see where the movement is from Maryland and Virginia. There's a heavy concentration in Gettysburg and Cumberland Township. And then also in the western townships where there is a lot of migration north and perhaps using the mountains and some of the water sources to disguise movement, especially with escaped slaves and runaway slaves. So we know from this, where the concentrations were. And then in Upper Adams, there's a really active Quaker community that you may know of that assisted in the protection of escaped slaves who were moving north. So you see quite a few families were living up in the northern townships near this Quaker community. And then there was, of course, a small African-American community near Biglerville called Yellow Hill, where African Americans lived. And they had a church and a cemetery there for many years. And so there's sporadic little pockets, but the heavy concentration was in the town of Gettysburg where there was work. And Jane's going to talk a little bit more later about the Third Ward. But I like to make the point when I've made these types of presentations that the Black community is not a monolith. There are people who were born here in Adams County, born as slaves, who were freed. There are people who were born free in Adams County. There are people coming from Maryland who were born free. There are people coming who were escaped slaves or set free. And then there are people who are mulatto. And then there are people who are of darker complexion. And so there's all these different subgroups within the Black community. And it's no one, there's not one unique experience that every single person, was a slave and then came here as an escaped slave. So I think it's important to remember that it's just like the whole community. There's all kinds of different people with different backgrounds. And we're going to talk about the early years here. And let me turn it over to Jane here, and she can talk a little bit about the early history of the Black community in the town and what she remembers from the stories she was told, if you want to, Jane.
Sure. The stories that I have are anecdotal. I do know, but I heard, like I said, they always said that there was a thriving Black community even before the Civil War. And blacksmith, they owned, well, I had a great grandfather that was a blacksmith, Cameron, and never knew anything about that. And they had their own social functioning because remember, this was a time that they had to stick together. And we'll talk a little bit later about the farms Black folk that owned farms on what is now the battlefield, which was really a revelation to me. But again, there was, and the stories that I tell, and I always say this, when I'm telling the stories, were they perfect folk? No, they were not. But you know what? None of us are. But I feel my role is, dear Gussie, they had it rough enough. I just want to share the glorious part that they gave to this community, to this county, to this country. And that started before the Civil War. There's talk about Mag Palm, and there was a lady, Keziah Cuff. I always liked her name. Keziah, what a cool name. And I know that she lived to be old, and there's controversy about how old she was when she died, but she was, an anecdotal story was that she kind of liked to talk like a sailor a little bit. And so there are lots of stories about that, but a well-respected woman, did lots of good stuff in the community. And so those are the kinds of things that they, folks came here, they wanted better for their families.
Right.
And they thought they could have that here. So they established a community here. And that sense of community still holds true with Gettysburg and the Black community. It's wonderful. Growing up, I was raised by a village, truly raised by a village. And I can think of the names, the Craigs, the Stantons, the Carters, the Penns, the Wansels. I mean, it was a very strong, vibrant community. And a lot of those names go back pre-Civil War. And as Andrew said, sometimes it just amazes me. I'm only the third generation away from slavery on my maternal side.
Right.
So it's very interesting to me.
That is amazing. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, and I think now we're going to transition, and Jane can speak to this much more than I can, but of the importance of religion in the community, especially very early on, and the different congregations that existed within the Black community. As early as the 1830s, there was an independent, Black congregation in Gettysburg, and in 1843 they purchased a property along Long Lane and built the first Black church in the town. They purchased it from Dr. David Gilbert, who I think was a contemporary of Thaddeus Stevens. And this church stood for many years and then was called many different things. And it's roughly where the John's Baptist Church is on Franklin Street in Gettysburg. It became the Baptist Church. I think it may go by a different name today. You can probably correct me on that, Jane. But for many years, it was the Baptist Church after it had been this early structure. And the buildings changed a lot over time. And I think at one point was torn down and completely rebuilt on a little bit of a different angle. But this is a really interesting story of this early congregation. Jane, do you want to talk a little bit about what you remember of this early group here in Gettysburg?
All I can share with you is what I've heard, again, anecdotal stories. Now, the Wesleyan, as I understood it, this is still kind of foggy to me. There are people that out here that have done, I know Gene Green has done extensive research on the Black churches here in town.
Right.
But what I understand anecdotally, the Wesleyan Church became Asbury United Methodist, not United, pardon me, dear Gussie, Asbury African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Right.
And then that eventually ended up on Franklin Street.
Right.
Then there was St. John's Baptist Church, which was on Franklin Street, and then St. Paul AME Zion, which was on Washington Street.
Right.
Now, I happened to see papers about St. Paul AME Zion, and that's the church I grew up in. And Lloyd F.A. Watts was one of the original members that bought land from Weldon.
Yeah, Singleton Weldon. That's right. Yeah. And that's the church that you may know well, because it is the only original church that's still standing. That, this church here on Franklin Street really doesn't resemble what it did. But the church on South Washington Street that you know well, that folks would pass by if they drove down South Washington Street, that's the one we're talking about. And we'll show you more on that, I think, in a couple slides.
Right.
But this second, go ahead, Jane. Did you want to make another point there?
Well, I think it's critical to mention too that the church was the hub of the community.
Right.
That's where everything started there. The social activism started there. We were taught and raised to be leaders from going to church. You were nurtured by church members. You were corrected by church members. It was the true hub of the community. The social events emanated from the churches, from all the churches, and the congregations would get along. I can remember growing up that when we would visit the Baptist church, and then the congregation from the Baptist church would visit our church. By the time that I could remember, Asbury Methodist, African Methodist, was no longer operating. Now, from the things that I heard and that I've seen and read, rather, was that the congregation became elderly, and then members moved on to the other two Black churches here in town. So it actually dissipated, and the church was beside the home that I grew up in on Franklin Street. So I remember going into that church. It was a beautiful little church on Franklin Street, and it was torn down, as many of the Black historical sites have been done in Gettysburg, were torn down. And the colored school, as they called it, was right beside it.
Right.
And the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Asbury, yes, Payne. Now, from what I understand, and I'm sure other people would know the story better than I, but from what I understand, Payne, who was a Methodist, African Methodist Episcopal preacher, was here in Gettysburg and went to the seminary.
Right.
And he was a part of starting the Asbury Church. And then he eventually left and participated with St. Paul AME Zion. In fact, there is a window in St. Paul AME Zion Church where Payne dedicated the window, and his name is written on the bottom of the window.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's important to note, again, the church was the central hub of the whole Black community. Everything emanated from the church. Everything did.
Wow. Yeah, and this is, as Jane mentioned, this is the church now that you're looking at on this slide along Franklin Street. And it was next to this school, which for many years was what was referred to as the colored school in Gettysburg. This is a picture of Sally Myers, a local teacher, with her students at the church. I think it's probably 1880s. And you can see just in the corner of the photograph on the right, a portion of the church, and we'll have to look for a better photo of that 1874 church that we can show you today. This is the site of I think it's called the brewery, the Franklin Street Brewery or something like that. Somebody can correct me, I'm sure, in the comments about the name, but if you're curious what site we're talking about. And then, as Jane mentioned, this is the 1917 and current church that you may be very familiar with, St. Paul AME Zion Church. And Jane, do you want to talk about the significance of this building? And I know you remember this building very well, and your great grandfather Lloyd Watts actually lived to see the construction of this church. Is that right?
Yes. As I understood, the church, the initial St. Paul AME Zion, was around the corner, is what they always said. It was around the corner. And then this church was built. And I read some things. It was very interesting. I shared this with Andrew. This is anecdotal. See, this is why I like looking at this stuff about the church. They spent $129 to buy the property for that church. And there were the names that I remember were Craig and Isaac Carter, Lloyd Watts, Bird, and there was one other gentleman, I forget his name. And then as time went on, they furnished the church, and they had a debt of $500. And what they decided to do was not get a minister there, because they would have to pay the minister. And they said that they would rather save the money to pay for the furniture. So they would select a parishioner to be ordained by the conference, that he would be the minister for the church. And so that's what they did. They saved the money then to pay off their debt, the $500 debt for the furnishings of the church. But this church, I have wonderful memories, and I know many of us from Gettysburg have wonderful memories of this church. Very vibrant, very involved in social justice in this town, and that because that was the hub. That's where you learned how to speak truth to power from the church.
Right.
So it was from all the Black churches, that's where you learn to speak truth to power, and that you were not quiet if you saw something that was not right, that you had to muster up the courage and speak to the injustice or whatever was not right. And that whole village supported you in doing it because you saw them speaking out. And imagine the times that they grew up in, because back in those times, the work that was available for people of color, domestic work, and then later on in the late 50s and 60s, factory work. And there were a few people that did other things, that were fortunate to be able to do other things. But by rule, there just were no other jobs. And I can remember, my uncles talking about when they would go downtown in Gettysburg when they were younger. They had to be out of downtown before dark. They could not be caught downtown before dark.
Wow.
Because it was not allowed. And most of the places in Gettysburg were segregated. And so you never hear any of that. And I can remember them talking, I won't mention the store or the place, where they would not go in because the owner was just very not nice to people of color. And that seemed to be the thing. So you can understand why they created a community there in the Third Ward where they supported each other. And it was home, were they perfect? No, but I loved growing up there. I wouldn't trade it for anything because it truly was a village, and the church was the hub of that.
Wow, that's wonderful. And here's another photograph of the church, a beautiful building. I'm sure many of you have driven by, and now you understand a little more about the history. I love listening to Jane tell stories about life in this the area of Gettysburg here, because we just don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of people that we know, at the Historical Society who have been in Gettysburg so long, and we're so in tune with the community, and the life during this period. So anyway, this is a photograph of the church, but I want to turn now back to some other issues that we alluded to, and one is slavery. And a lot of people don't realize that Pennsylvania, although it's considered a free state, was the scene of quite a bit of slavery early on. And actually, Pennsylvania, though, was one of the first states to enact a gradual abolition of slavery. In 1780, the state legislature passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And a lot of people wonder, what does the gradual abolition mean? There were some rules. If you were a slave at the time, you would still have to remain enslaved for the rest of your life. And your children would have to be slaves until the age of 26. But if you were born after and you weren't the child of a slave, you were free. So there was this gradual abolition that kind of phased slavery out. But there was slavery in Gettysburg and in Adams County. And right here, we're showing newspaper ads for runaway slaves and the sale of slaves that appeared in our local newspapers, the Gettysburg Compiler and the Adams Sentinel. And these ads, you can see one's from 1811, one's from 1820. And it really speaks to what life was like here in Gettysburg. There was slavery in the town, and the founder of the town, James Geddes, owned slaves. Alexander Dobbin, the owner of the Dobbin House, owned slaves. Many of the very early prominent families had slaves. James Geddes' slave, the name of the enslaved woman was Sidney Bryan, or O'Brien on some records. And we actually have the Bible that belonged to Sidney's family here at the Adams County Historical Society. This is the family Bible for her daughter, who was named Getty Ann Stanton. And there's some, and Jane could speak to this much more than I can, but there are stories that Getty Ann was actually a direct descendant of James Geddes, and it would be amazing to do some sort of a DNA test, because we know descendants of James Geddes and we know descendants of Getty Ann and Sidney. So one day, perhaps that could be something that could be done to clarify that story. But nonetheless, this is a really wonderful established early family. And I always love pointing out, during the Battle of Gettysburg, Sidney Bryan, the slave of the town founder, she had been set free and was living as a free person in a house that she owned in Gettysburg on South Washington Street during the Battle of Gettysburg. So that really gives you a perspective of how slavery was really not all that long ago here in Pennsylvania at the time of the Civil War. And then one wonderful story that we love is Owen Robinson. We have a photograph. This is, I guess, a lithograph of him from a Philadelphia newspaper. He lived in Gettysburg on High Street. This is a picture of his home, which no longer stands, unfortunately. But he was born a slave in Maryland and made his way to Gettysburg. And he became one of the first Black entrepreneurs, if not the first, here in the town. And we have some accounts of his business in Gettysburg. This is Charles McCarty, a young boy who lived nearby. He said, from the beginning of the Civil War, Owen had lived in constant dread of being captured and taken south. I think he had been a slave before coming to Gettysburg and for many years before, although I do not know how he obtained his freedom. And Owen had a ice cream shop on Chambersburg Street in Gettysburg. And so Charles McCarty, I think later in the quote, he says he would go to the shop and watch the fascinating process of making the ice cream. And sometimes there was a little gleaning to be had, for Owen and I were on friendly terms. So this is a wonderful account about this shop. And we actually have some newspaper articles about Owen Robinson and his shop on Chambersburg Street. It was located near where the Adams County National Bank offices are, on the first block of Chambersburg Street. But Owen actually had an oyster saloon, and the oysters were eaten in the winter, and in the summer you had ice cream. So here's two ads from the Civil War period that talk about this early business in Gettysburg. And then when Owen was an old man, they kind of mixed up his age, and they said he was 110. He probably was really in his 90s at the time when he passed away. But like many former enslaved people, he didn't really know his birth date, and people would come up to him and say, Owen, you must be 100, and he'd say, yeah, probably. And then 10 years later they'd come back and say, wow, Owen's 110. And so there's these articles about him, and I think his headstone actually says he's 110 when he dies. So it's a really wonderful story about him and the contribution he made to Gettysburg, which really can't be understated, having this early business and being such a well-known figure in Gettysburg. So now we'll move on to another story some of you may know well, and that's the story of Mag Palm, or Margaret Palm. And she was born here, we think, in Adams County, and then at a very young age ended up at the Adams County Almshouse, or poorhouse. And as a young girl, she was bound out to a local white family where she served basically as a servant and a farm laborer, and for many years. And then when she was old enough, ended up she was married to Alfred Palm in Gettysburg, and they lived for many years on the edge of the Gettysburg battlefield during the Civil War period, and then they moved to a house on Long Lane. But in 1858, Mag Palm was a washerwoman in the town of Gettysburg, and when she left her work in the evening, one evening, she was grabbed by a group of men. And here are the original accounts of the kidnapping, or the attempted kidnapping. They were slave catchers and were attempting to take Mag into slavery, although she had been born free. But because we're so close to the Mason-Dixon line, just 7 or 8 miles from the Mason-Dixon line, there were frequent groups of slave catchers that would come into Adams County and just grab people and try to sell them into slavery. But Mag was able to fight them off, and she, really showed incredible courage and in fighting for her life and her existence. And she supposedly bit off the thumb of one of the slave catchers, which is just a wonderful story that I think every student in Adams County should hear. And we have a photograph of her here. She's photographed later on in Gettysburg, and she's demonstrating how they had tried to tie her hands before she successfully fought them off. So this is a wonderful account of courage and bravery in the Black community in this really frightening time before the Civil War, when there were raids and kidnappings happening quite frequently. And then here's another photograph of Mag Palm, and I want to let Jane just briefly explain here what this chair is. This is a chair owned by the Black History Museum. Can you tell us where this came from, Jane?
Surely. Mag Palm's great-granddaughter, Catherine Stanton Carter, was my godmother. And when she passed away, she had she had this chair. And when she passed this away, she left this chair to our family. And now it's a part of the Gettysburg Black History Museum artifacts. And when I look at Mag Palm, I shared this with some members of the Gettysburg Black History Board and also with Andrew. When I look at pictures of her, I can see Catherine. Catherine Stanton Carter, who was my godmother. And Catherine Stanton Carter had a lot of the same kind of spirit that Mag Palm had, the very giving, but no nonsense, liked to have fun, but did not play. So, and that's kind of the thing. And it's a beautiful chair. Of course, it was reupholstered, but it's still, still usable, and we have used it. But it's a part of the Gettysburg Black History Museum artifacts.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Civil War period. And I wanted to start off just by pointing out that there are many sites on the Gettysburg battlefield associated with Black families and Black farms. The family William Job or William Job were tenant farmers on the first day's battlefield. The family of Sophia Devan lived on the Emmitsburg Road just south of Gettysburg. Of course, Abraham Bryan is famous for for having lived right on the edge of Pickett's, the fields of Pickett's charge on the Gettysburg battlefield. And then further south, and I'll let Jane talk about this, of course, in a few minutes, because she's so related to the story, but the Watts and Warfield farms were located on the southern portion of the battlefield along Confederate Avenue. And then there's some post-war sites like the Timbers Farm. The foundation of the Timbers Farm is still there in the fields near Devil's Den. I guess it would be a little bit west of Devil's Den. And then the family of Basil Biggs lived at the Crawford Farm along Marsh Creek. So many sites on the Gettysburg battlefield, some you may have heard of, some maybe not, associated with Black history. And one, of course, is Basil Biggs. Now, this is not a picture of where he lived at the time of the Civil War. He purchased this farm on the Taneytown Road after the Battle of Gettysburg, after the Civil War. But during the battle, he lived out at the farm of William Crawford and John Crawford out along Marsh Creek. And there, he and his family had fled before the Confederates arrived in fear of being captured. When they returned, they found the house had been ransacked and destroyed, and there were over 40 Confederates buried in the front yard and then the orchard of the house. And Basil Biggs ended up taking the contract, or getting the contract, to help reinter a lot of the Union dead in the National Cemetery here in Gettysburg. He had a crew of other Black residents who helped with this really awful and gruesome task. It's hard to imagine how absolutely horrendous this must have been, and to spend your entire day moving bodies out of shallow graves into the National Cemetery. But here's a photograph of Biggs and his wife, Mary Jackson, outside their later home on the Taneytown Road. I should point out, too, Basil Biggs was a well-known veterinarian in Gettysburg, and his family, I think a lot of his descendants still live in the area. I know one of them, a couple of them very well, as does Jane. But Basil Biggs was really a pillar in the community at the time of the Civil War, and a real kind of jack of all trades. Did you want to add anything about Biggs, Jane?
Yes, I just wanted to say he was very prominent in the Black community, and you never hear much about his social justice things that he did. He was very keen on standing. And imagine at that time, a Black man speaking truth to power. And he did. He had a lot to lose, but he did. But the stories that I heard about him being a vet and also being a pillar of the community and being very comfortable in speaking out against things that were just not right. And he did that. But, and really all you ever hear is about how he buried the story was that they paid him 50 cents, to bury bodies. Now, I don't know, was it 50 cents a body or what was it? But that's all you really hear. You never hear anything about what a leader he was in the community.
Right.
And about him being a vet. And what I always heard too about his vet skills, that other vets would come to him to ask him about how to handle something. And you're right, Andrew, a lot of his descendants are still here and have done wonderful things in this community, still continue to do wonderful things in this community. And as I shared with you, Roger Smith, who has done a lot of research, is on our board of directors, was married to a descendant of his, Jesse Wanzel Smith. And so, as I said, there are still lots of descendants here doing wonderful things.
Right. That is incredible. Yeah, and I think that's a good transition too into what we wanted to talk about here, which is, and we already did touch on this, but the what's known as the Third Ward community is that southwestern quadrant of the town of Gettysburg that was the predominantly Black community, and to an extent still is. I know it's still a majority minority section of Gettysburg. And Jane, did you want to point out anything else about this? I know we covered some of this earlier.
Well, let's just talk about the genesis of why
Sure.
it is the ward of color. In growing up, it always had, if you heard Third Ward, it always had like a negative spin to it. It was always given a negative spin. Well, I didn't see that. I grew up there. It was no different from any other community in or ward in Gettysburg. It was just Black folk and people of color were relegated to living there. It
Right.
wasn't until, I'm sure, I don't know, but it wasn't until, I guess, the 60s that Black folk really started buying homes outside of the Third Ward because it was redlined. Banks wouldn't loan money to Black folk to buy homes. So
Right.
if they bought a home and they owned it, it was in the Third Ward. And it wasn't until later that Black folk could start buying homes in other areas. Even in renting, you couldn't rent, still to this day. It's just amazing to me because remember, I grew up at a time where Black folk lived in the Third Ward and they were not allowed to live in any other area. And I see now, Black folk live all over Gettysburg now. That's such a wonderful thing. And in years past, as I was growing up, that just did not happen. White folk did not rent to people of color.
Right.
So it was an area that people of color were relegated to. So what happened? It's that thing that I name it Black joy. That yes, we may have been relegated to live there, but we made a home, we made a community there. It was a community and we looked after each other and we cared for each other. Was it perfect? No. But was it a community? Yes, yes. And there's still remnants of that. Now, things have changed. I mean, for everybody, things have changed, but it's still the Third Ward. They've tried to change the name to Old Getty Place, and which is fine because, like I said, that they always try to attach a negative connotation to the Third Ward. And I can remember even like with the voting, they made the Third Ward, I think now has 2 precincts because Colt Park became the second precinct of Third Ward. Because the Third Ward, I think it's bounded by Middle Street, Baltimore Street, and Steinway Avenue.
Right.
And those streets in between are all the Third Ward. It was a cool place to grow up in, and it was diverse. It was, as I recall, growing up, there were white folk that grew up in the Third Ward with me. The religious affiliations were diverse. It was just a wonderful place to grow up.
Right.
Of course, hindsight says that, but it was. It was.
That's great, Jane.
Okay.
Yeah, and a couple other things we haven't talked about yet are the burial places for the Black community in Gettysburg, and we've talked about this a little bit in past programs. But along York Street, there was a Black cemetery as early as 1828. And then that was abandoned in 1906, or I shouldn't say abandoned, but it was moved to a different location, and the property was sold off. And it's right next to the current bike shop that you may know out on York Street at the intersection with 3rd Street. And then in 1867, there was a cemetery established along Long Lane that you may know called Lincoln Cemetery. And here's a photograph from the 1970s and then what it looks like now. I have a note here, at least 444 people buried here, although only 219 have marked stones. So about half, a little more than half, do not have a headstone of the individuals we know to be buried there. And then we have a wonderful database on our website you can check out that has all of the known burials and information about them. But this is a wonderful story of the establishment of this cemetery by a group of local Black leaders, the Sons of Goodwill, who established this cemetery and then built onto it over the years. And it's really a wonderful site to visit in Gettysburg if you haven't already done so.
I would like to interject before we
Sure.
move on.
Yeah,
I'd like to commend Mrs. Betty Myers for taking over and seeing that it's being cared for, and she's done research and has written a book about it, and very appreciative of that. And because it, as you can see, the slide on the left, it was in disrepair.
right.
It wasn't being taken care of. And I can recall my Aunt Hazel, before it was taken care of, this was years ago, going up there with her lawnmower and mowing the lawn, and with her son, Carl Gandy Saunders, mowing. But Mrs. Betty Myers has taken this over, and it's now taken care of. The lawn is mowed, the grass is mowed, and it's taken care of. So she needs to be recognized for that.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I'd like to talk about here too, I don't really know that much. All that I know is that there are lots of United States colored troops buried here in this cemetery because they were not allowed to be buried in the National Cemetery.
Right.
And there was a very large population of Black men who enlisted in the Union Army and served in the United States colored troops.
Right.
And I was just amazed when I looked at the number of men, of Black men that joined the Union Army to fight for the Union Army with the colored
Right.
troops.
Over 70. Yeah.
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 Yes. And that's pretty phenomenal for this little town, I'll tell you.
Right.
And I guess why it's so close to me is my great grandfather, Lloyd Watts, was a sergeant. And then his brother, John Watts, was also in the colored troops. And he fought at Alsty. And this is something you never hear in or read about in the history books. I never knew that the colored troops were at Appomattox when Lee surrendered.
Right.
Well, they were. And John was in the 8th United States colored troops. So see, these things you never hear anything about. And the cemetery, a lot of the men, John Watts is buried there, Lloyd Watts is buried there. There's, as Andrew said, over 70, there's 70 some.
Yeah, in that cemetery we know of 30, but overall there are 70 United States colored troops from Adams County.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's again a part of the American story that's not been told.
Right.
And they were not allowed to be buried in the National Cemetery.
Right. And I think the title of Mrs. Myers' book is really appropriate. It's called Segregation and Death. And we'd really recommend that you check that out because it has some wonderful information about the cemetery and its history. Good. Yeah, I know we're just about at time. We're going to go a little longer tonight because we have a lot more to talk about. But so we hope you'll stick with us. But if not, this will be on YouTube tomorrow, so you can check it out as well. But we wanted to talk a little bit more about military service because we just mentioned and alluded to the USCTs. And here's some wonderful photographs of local Black veterans. Would you like to tell us who we're looking at here, Jane, in these photographs?
Sure. The very handsome man in the left is Robert Thomas, and the gentleman on the right is Carl Thomas, and the gentleman below there is Mr. Sam Stanton, and he was a Buffalo soldier. Now that absolutely is an amazing story. Again, a part of the American story that we never hear anything about. A Buffalo soldier with Roosevelt. How about that?
Right. Yeah.
And he was related to Catherine Stanton Carter. And he brought back for Catherine, and Catherine wore it all the time. There was a gold ring that she wore. And he brought that back for her when he came back from soldiering. And I was always enamored of that ring because she had beautiful hands.
That's wonderful. Those are just wonderful photographs, Jane. And we should note those are from the Gettysburg Black History Museum collection. Yes. And we're excited to be working with you on an exhibit where we can have some of these photographs included in our new museum. So that's going to just be fantastic to highlight those stories. And then at the end here, we have a little bit about Jack Hopkins. So his son was one of the USCT soldiers that we talked about. And Jack was the janitor at Gettysburg College. And there's a lot of oral tradition in the Black community about the involvement of men like Hopkins with the Underground Railroad and runaway slaves. And of course, was, along with the military service was this social justice. And Jane has already talked about that, but it was so important, in the community. And we know of a lot of the white abolitionists and the white community members who helped with the Underground Railroad, but we don't know a lot about the Black members of the Underground Railroad in the written record. But this oral history, like Jane mentioned earlier, is just so wonderful because it fills in the gap that we don't have. Did you want to add anything else on that, Jane? And while you're talking, I'll move on to the Jack Hopkins house.
Okay. Well, the military service, I think, is critical. There's also people I'm sure are not aware. There was a gentleman that served in World War II that rode with Patton in the tanks.
Right.
And just lots of wonderful stories. And there are wonderful pictures that we have of African Americans that served during World War II and all the wars. They all served in the wars. And so, Andrew, if you would like to talk about the Hopkins house.
Yeah, sure. So, and as we mentioned, Jack Hopkins was the janitor at Gettysburg College during the Civil War. It was then called Pennsylvania College. But we have this wonderful photograph. Actually, both are from Gettysburg College's collections, and they show the Hopkins house that was located just behind Pennsylvania Hall. And here is where he lived at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he and his family fled and then returned and found their house and all the surrounding buildings had been used as hospitals for the wounded soldiers. So Jack Hopkins is really a central figure in Gettysburg during that period. This is a photograph from Gettysburg College of Jack that appeared in the yearbook in, I think, 1862. And then here's Jack's obituary. I always like to show this image. There were two newspapers in Gettysburg at the time. I think Jack Hopkins died in 1867 or 1868. I'd have to check the exact year, but this is the obituary. And this one actually tagged a line on at the end, which I think really speaks to the attitudes of the time and the racism that existed in this one newspaper, but not so much in the other that chose to not include this line. But I like to point this out. It says, it talks about Jack and, his life, and then says he always knew his place and was universally respected for it. So just a really kind of awful comment that was added that kind of is a smudge on the end of the obituary. And I think it really speaks to the times and the attitudes that people had in Gettysburg about the Black community. But Jack's story is really wonderful, and I think it's so important to remember that he was the central figure at the college and also in the Black community. And then, of course, we have a wonderful story of Jane's great-grandfather, Lloyd Watts. This is a photograph of him. I'll let Jane talk about him for, of course, in a minute here, because she knows his story better than anybody. But this is a wonderful photograph of Lloyd Watts that we have in the Historical Society collection. And it's part of a collage of all the educators in Adams County in the 1870s and 80s. Lloyd Watts was a school teacher. He was a minister. He was a veteran of the United States Colored Troops. He was a community leader. And Jane can tell you even more about him. So I'll move to the next slide here and show you some of these images that Jane has generously provided to us. And why don't you tell us what you remember about your great-grandfather, this wonderful pillar of the community here in Gettysburg?
Lots of stories about him. Lots of wonderful stories about him. Well, he moved here from Carroll County. His family moved here from Carroll County, and he could read and write when he moved here. And his family, I've been researching his family, and I just recently found the eureka moment. I always heard that his one brother moved west with the Mormons. I've got to share this with you because it was so exciting to me. They always said his brother Harry moved west with the Mormons. Well, I finally found the documentation that he did move west. His brother Harry did move west with the Mormons, and that I read a letter, and Harry borrowed $10 from Lloyd to go west with the Mormons. And Harry promised that he would pay Lloyd back whenever he got where he was supposed to be going. But Lloyd, again, he was another one that liked to have fun, they said, but he did not play. And I can remember stories of my one aunt saying that they would climb up in his lap and brush his hair. And he would call them little yaps. Get out of the way, you little yaps. You're making too much noise. You're yapping all the time. Just yap it. So, but he was a Sunday school teacher. Two, he did all kinds of stuff in the community. And as he got older, then he owned a home on Washington Street. He had one child, Laura Watts, my grandmother.
Wow.
And her story was very interesting. And I'm researching this too. They said the stories I heard was that she was very learned too, but she didn't go to school. She was tutored by the seminarians. So I'm researching that story now. I haven't found anything concrete yet. That's the oral history, but I have to again say that every story that they've shared with me over the years, whether it was my family or other folk in the community, it's proven to be correct. The other thing about the Watts family, and Andrew showed the slide, and I know we're getting short on time. The Watts family owned a farm right beside the Warfield family, and it's at the juncture there, Confederate Avenue, and I forget what the other avenue is.
Right.
But the poignant point of that is there were other Black farmers around there, and that's where Pickett's charge was. That's where all the Confederate soldiers were. Isn't that ironic that Black farmers owned that land? That to me is a very powerful story that should be told.
Right. And I should say this just for people who are listening and wondering, the Watts family owned this house. And it stood right where what is called the Longstreet Tower is along Confederate Avenue. So there was a Black-owned farm right there along that strip of land where the monuments are to Georgia and South Carolina, and of course the tower that I'm sure many of you have climbed before. So that's a wonderful, it'd be wonderful. I think Jane and I have talked about this to eventually have some sort of marking at that site to commemorate the fact that this was the Watts family farm, because there isn't any reference to it other than a couple maps that we know of, and we have the deeds for it here too at the Historical Society. That's great. Yeah, why don't we, so we're going to shift a little bit now and talk in these last few slides about the post-Civil War period and some of the stories that Jane remembers, and a lot of wonderful photographs here provided by the Gettysburg Black History Museum. You may know on the left here, this is a photograph you may have seen. I think it's been published in some books. I know it was in Bill Frazanito's book. It shows the log store at the corner of, I think it's Breckenridge and South Washington Street. And this is a photograph of William Lyles, I believe, who was a reverend and also the storekeeper. And Jane, do you want to talk about these two photographs and what they represent?
Well, I remember them talking about Lyle's store. It was very prominent in their community, and it was a log cabin place. And the house now is right on the corner. It's right across the street from St. Paul's, and it has white siding on it, but the logs are still under there. And then the other pictures there, you see, was the Bronze Inn. On the end, you see some young people there, and that was a restaurant. And you see now today their apartments. But again, see, there was the need for something like that because Black folk could not go to restaurants downtown. And so this was like a hub, a social place, and different people owned it at different times. And again, it was a place where people could gather. And I heard stories. My mother and my godmother, Catherine, used to serve as waitresses there as young people. My grandfather ran it with Mr. Myers. And I heard stories of how they would go to Baltimore and get the oysters and bring them there. And with the education, I forgot to mention this, the education part of it when we talked about the colored school, and I have to get this in because the schools in Gettysburg were segregated. That's why there was a colored school. And when they were going to integrate, and I believe the year was 1929 when they integrated schools. And I don't know, Andrew, you'll have to fact check me on that.
Right, that's about right, I think, yeah.
But anyway, the KKK, they were going to burn a cross on the corner of High Street and what is that? High Street and Washington Street.
Yes.
And the stories were that my grandfather and Mr. Billy Biggs went to Baltimore in their little pickup truck and got guns and came back and then dared the KKK to come light it that evening. Well, they didn't come light it. and the schools were integrated. So that was a little anecdotal story that I thought
Wow.
was very interesting and showed real courage and guts. Just imagine, dear Gussie, and imagine traveling to Baltimore back then
Right.
and to get guns.
Yeah, and that story's confirmed too in the Gettysburg Times. There's a wonderful
Mhm.
article, the account of that incident, and they
Mhm.
said, I think it was your grandfather who said if they try to come back, they won't leave town,
Right.
and they never came to light the cross. And like you said, they really pushed to make things fair and just in Gettysburg, and that's a part of the story we're excited to be covering in our new building, the fight for the integration and the desegregation in Gettysburg. And we there's so many stories of courage and people fighting to make things fair for everybody who lives here. So these are wonderful stories that we want to tell. And this is a nice segue into this photograph because it's, I think, one of my favorite photographs that's in the collections of the Black History Museum. Would you like to tell us, Jane, about what this photograph is showing and how important this is to the community?
This picture I remember from a young child, always looking at this and asking my mother about this picture. This picture was taken on High Street in Gettysburg, and what was then the Elks. It was the American Legion, the Black American Legion at one point. And every year, she said, every year when she was growing up, when it was the Elks, there was a big Christmas party for the Black community, and they would all gather there. They would have a big dinner and they would socialize and dance and sing and have a good time. And then they would all gather for a picture out front. Now, what is very interesting to me and what I love about this picture, she would tell me who these people were. My grandfather is the very tall man on the very right on the end.
Wow.
And my mother is in the front. You can't see her face. She's hiding in the back. She's a little kid in a little pinafore. And then Mag Palm's granddaughter, Miss Louise Stanton, Auntie, is in the front holding my godmother, Catherine Stanton Carter, when she was little. And Miss Keziah Cuff is in the front sitting with the gray hair. And she was, we talked about her earlier. And some of the names, that's how I would remember the names. And Mr. Disnick is in there, and he has the big glasses on. And I always remembered him because I wore glasses as a little kid, and he always stuck out to me. But this was really showed the community.
And we should say
Really,
people should also note the trombone that they see in the photograph.
yes, with my Uncle Howard Thomas with the trombone.
Right.
And, oh, there we go. This is the Syncopated Five. This
Wow.
was a Black musical group, and this was taken in the living room of a home that still stands on High Street.
Wow.
And the gentleman that's the trombone, and that's Howard Thomas. He's my uncle. And David Jones is playing the piano. He's my uncle. And my uncle playing the saxophone. Can you guess that I come from a musical family? And Mr. Skinny Johnson, as they called him, as my mom called him, is the one with the megaphone. Now the other ones, I don't recall their names.
Wow. This
But
is a
they,
wonderful photograph, Jane. And this is something we'll definitely be including in our joint exhibits. This is just great. And then let me show this wonderful artifact. Do you want to tell the story of what this is? It's the same trombone, I believe, right?
yeah, that is the trombone that's in the pictures that my Uncle Howard played. And we had that. That's a part of the artifacts at the Gettysburg Black History Museum. Our family donated it to the Black History Museum. And it's still in good shape. And I have a young cousin that learned how to play the trombone on this trombone until they could afford a real one.
That is amazing. What an incredible piece that represents, life during that period in Gettysburg. Here are more photographs. We should point out these are all from the Gettysburg Black History Museum collection. Wonderful images, and you can see a family Bible. And do you know who the gentleman is at the far left here, Jane?
Um, No, I don't. I'd have to look very closely.
No,
I'm sure I do,
I
but
look
I'd
very
look
uniform.
closely at that.
Yeah, it's
The
just
lady.
beautiful photographs. And I should, point out all these items will be incorporated into the archives at the Adams County Historical Society's new facility where we can properly house them and put them in archivally safe materials. So if you support this initiative, we'd really appreciate your help to make sure all these items and the whole story of Adams County is told and preserved. And here's another photograph of images from the collection that are just really remarkable. And Jane, you had a really great story about this photograph on the right. Do you want to
Yeah,
tell the people watching where this was taken?
that picture was taken at the Savoy in Harrisburg. Black folk, it was a black club, of course, and it was the words that they used, hoity toity. They would get dressed up and go over there. So you would imagine that those folks had to have a little bit of money to be able to do that. And they went over to Harrisburg, and it was a social club,
Wow.
and they would go over there and do that. And I believe the lady on the end is a Timbers, and the woman in the middle, I'm not sure. I could be two people. I'm not sure which one it is.
Wow, those are just beautiful images. I think I was talking to our historian Tim Smith earlier. He thinks he recognizes the stoop that this was taken on, so we'll have to go out and look for
Oh,
it.
oh,
And then here's another. I mean, we talked about this, alluded to it earlier, but the Black community was really intimately involved with early tourism in Gettysburg, as drivers, as battlefield guides, running hotels and working in hotels as well. And William F. Penn was the first Black battlefield guide, and we actually here at the Historical Society have his test that he took to become a guide. But Jane has in the Black History Museum collection his business card and this wonderful photograph of him with a group of visitors at Devil's Den. So we're really excited to tell this story and unite these materials, his test and his records from when he was a guide, and also the materials that you see here. Aren't I think these are great, Jane?
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
wonderful.
And never knew anything about that until we started looking into this. Now,
Right.
this woman is very interesting. Andrew, can you share her story? This
Yeah,
is
sure. This, and I should point out that on the left, this photograph is from the Black History Museum collection. But Laura Brown was born in Gettysburg. I believe she was the granddaughter of Basil Biggs, and
mhm,
she ended up moving to Pittsburgh. And she served in the Women's Christian Temperance Union for many, many years. Was very high up in the state organization, and she was actually the first Black woman to run for elected office in statewide in Pennsylvania. And it's just an amazing story. She lost her election, but she ran and was one of the first. And I think there's a textbook I saw recently that said she was the second woman of color in the entire country to run for statewide office. So a wonderful story about her. She was an organizer. She helped with suffrage and the movement to win the right to vote here in Gettysburg. She traveled and spoke at various conventions and events. And she's buried here in the Lincoln Cemetery in Gettysburg. And what's so surprising about this story to me is she doesn't have a headstone. So she's one of the 240 something or 225 who have unmarked stones in Lincoln Cemetery in Gettysburg. But a really fantastic story, and we want to highlight her and her contribution to Gettysburg history and to Pennsylvania history in our new museum. And I think this is one of the final, this is probably the final slide. And we wanted to end on this one because Jane felt strongly about including this wonderful story of Dr. Lewis King. Jane, why don't you tell us, because you knew Dr. Lewis
yeah,
King when he was in
yeah.
Gettysburg, why don't you tell us about his role and his involvement with the National Park Service? I just think it's a wonderful story for us to end on tonight.
He was a wonderful man, a man ahead of his time. And we called him Doc King. He was from Barbados. He lived on Washington Street, and his wife, Mrs. King, and his story is very interesting. He is the first Black man to receive a doctorate from Columbia University in anthropology.
Wow.
And they did not want to give him his doctorate. He had to fight for it because he was Black. And he came back to Gettysburg, and he worked at the Park Service, and he worked at the Naval Depot in Harrisburg, up in Mechanicsburg. But I have to share a story with you. He also did some work at Gettysburg College. He taught at Gettysburg College for a short period of time in the early 70s. And I happened to go to one of his lectures one year. I was a senior in high school, and I will never forget it. It has stuck with me, and I share with this story with everybody when I talk. He said he started out his lecture with, "You've got to be carefully taught," from the song from South Pacific. And if you've heard the song and the lyrics, "You've got to be carefully taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught." And he was a very quiet man, what I knew of him. And he is the first person that I ever learned that there was a Negro national anthem. And he would not sit quietly if he saw any injustice. And when it was not comfortable, this man would stand. And he was very active in St. Paul AME Zion Church also, and was clearly a groundbreaker and a trailblazer. And I'm sitting here tonight partly because he helped to build a bridge for me to be here and to do things in my life. So he was a wonderful man, and I always remember, you've got to be carefully taught. And I share that with everyone and his story.
Right. That is so wonderful, Jane. We appreciate so much hearing your wonderful stories about all of these remarkable people. I should note too, the photograph, you may have noticed he was pointing with his pointing stick on the at the COPE map, the large map that is in the visitor center today, and was such an influential member of the early national park crew here in Gettysburg. And I'm sure we'll do more on him in the future to highlight his story. But thank you all so much for joining us. And I really, I see all these wonderful comments, and we really appreciate you joining us tonight. And I'm so thankful to Jane and the Black History Museum for playing a part in our new facility. And we're thrilled to be working together to bring all these stories forward. I personally, just having grown up in the community in Gettysburg, not being exposed to Black history, I just think it's such a tragedy that our local students aren't exposed to these wonderful stories of perseverance and courage and bravery and resilience in the face of all these different obstacles and factors. So Jane is a living testament to how the thriving Black history that we have in Gettysburg, and we're going to have more and more of this over the next year. So I hope you'll continue to tune into these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's, I know many of you have already donated, but we really appreciate your support through these videos each week. And tonight's gifts through the video will be split 50-50 between our two organizations. So it's a great way to support not just one local nonprofit, but two of Gettysburg's history-themed nonprofits. So Jane, thank you so much for doing this with us. And I promise all the listeners who are hoping for another part 2, I see a lot of comments asking for that. We will definitely have a part 2 and a part 3. And this is something we'll continue, not just in February during Black History Month, but during every month of the year, and every time we do a program related to Gettysburg and Adams County's history, you can be sure that there will be an element of Black history because of the contributions made by the Black community over 300 years of Gettysburg and Adams County's story. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we will be back with you next week. Thank you so much, Jane, for being
Thank you. And thank you to the board members of the Gettysburg Black History Museum they truly helped to put me here and give me what I need to do this. Yeah. Thank you all. And thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Andrew. All right. You're a trailblazer yourself, young man.
Good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Good night. Good night.